Greetings, dear listeners. This is Jonah Goldberg, host of the Remnant podcast, brought to you by the Dispatch and Dispatch Media. So we have a first-time guest, guy I've known for a depressingly long time. Back when he was wearing different hats, which we don't have to get fully into all the hats this guy has worn, but for a long while now, he has been the grand poobah at the Foundation for the Defense of Democracies, a great once small and scrappy think tank that is now sort of playing with the big dogs more and more. And it has it punches. It is from the founding punched above its weight class, and does so more and more. And Cliff May has a weekly column in the Washington Times. He does a podcast called, which I'm just going to say it now. I hate the title. Foreign
It's
Policy.
Kind of a dad's joke. What can I tell you?
Yeah, it's up there with the Chuck Todd cast. And puns.
Pod Save America.
Yeah,
it's kind of old to make jokes about the word pod. I guess at this point, but it was. I hear you. Okay,
yeah. It's also it's also very strange that and we're going to be cleaning up the mess from the era of the last 20. I'm not talking about foreign policy yet. I'm just talking about stupid words, like no one has an iPod. Like an iPod barely. I mean, I'm sure that you can still get one like for jogging or whatever, but basically iPods don't exist anymore, and the word pod being attached to that is weird. And like kids today, their conception of what a phone is what when we were kids was a conception of was a tricorder from Star Trek, right? This supercomputer that can do a million things. So anyway, it's
and
all
I probably have a
strange.
Walkman somewhere here in this desk if I looked for it. So
yeah, no, I probably do too. Somewhere around here. I might have thrown it in the cat kennel with the intern, so that he would have something to listen to. Okay, let's start from the top. You have officially become a foreign policy graybeard. How do you see things now?
First, thanks for having me on. I love the show. Listen to it, read you. You do great work.
We'll get you great doctors.
Okay,
but go on.
I see a very complex. Let me put it this way: when FDD started, and I can tell you a little bit more about how it started. But we opened our doors just in January of 2002. I mean, I quit my job and began working on it just after 9/11, right? And at that point, the world, we believed that there was a real problem with things like Islamism and jihadism, which for most people were new words, with terrorism, with all the organizations and regimes that were driving and justifying terrorism. But that was really it. Because if you think back to 2001, 2002, Putin, I mean, the Berlin Wall fell down. There was no Soviet Union. Bush looked into Putin's eyes, got a glimpse of his soul, didn't think it was so bad. And as for China, it was 2001. We gave them most favored nation status, brought them in the WTO. The theory, and I think on both sides of the aisle, people believed once China gets rich, it's going to be liberal, moderate, a good stakeholder in the international order. All that's good. That's not what has evolved. And as we see it at FDD, we're not alone in this, what's evolved is an axis of aggressors led by Xi Jinping in Beijing, with his junior partner being Vladimir Putin, and then also Ali Khamenei in Tehran and Kim Jong-un in Pyongyang, North Korea. And they are threatening South Korea. South Korea is threatened. Taiwan is threatened. Ukraine is fighting for its very life and existence. And Israel has been at war for over a year, doing better, but still very much threatened. So again, not to be too wonky, the threat matrix has gotten more challenging and more difficult. And while I think a lot of think tankers understand it this way, and people like Neil Ferguson get it this way, and H.R. McMaster sees it this way, I'm not and I think some of Trump's advisors see it this way. I'm not sure that he does yet.
Mm-hmm. Just a quibble on there. I'm not saying I disagree, but just for clarification, when you say that Xi is the at the top of the pyramid of the threats, and that Putin and these guys are junior partners, I certainly agree with that if your criteria is who's the most
Right.
powerful, right? And who's the um uh and who has the most cards to play, to use a metaphor that Donald Trump seems to like a great deal. Um but it seems to me that China, I mean, the long term, I think China's obviously the primary threat to American national security, or challenge, if we want to say that. I really
Threat.
don't care. But the China for the last 30 years has been more and more assertive, but it has still tried to. It still benefited from free riding on the international order and these international institutions, and didn't want to see them all ripped up because it was still using them for its own benefit. Russia has been undermining those institutions, and has been more of a cross-border aggressor than China has. I mean, I take a backseat to no one about what it's doing in Tibet and with the Uyghurs and all that, but um, but it seems to me like if you're talking about the biggest threat in the near term, or the way you were describing it, it feels like Russia and Iran are different characters, have a different nature when it comes to foreign policy than China does, and that China's happy to have them muck around, but I don't know that China's telling Russia and Iran to be the bad actors that they are. They're just willing to benefit from the chaos of it.
No, I don't. I
Does that make sense?
disagree with that. I mean, it's an odd alliance, obviously, because you've got communist China, and I would argue that Xi Jinping is very much a communist, very much a Maoist.
Yeah.
Ali Khamenei in Tehran obviously is an Islamist and a jihadist. Putin is a neo-imperialist. And Kim Jong-un, I don't know, actually, I'm not sure. I never what to call it, a dynastic dictator. They all want to see the U.S. displaced as the preeminent power. And China believes, Xi Jinping believes that communist China can be and should be the most important country on earth, and will be. And we know that largely because when Matt Pottinger was in the last administration, well, in the first Trump administration, and I'm sure you know Matt Pottinger. I don't know if you've had him on. He's at Hoover, but he also chairs our Asia department. He's very fluent in Mandarin, and he scraped through the speeches and writings that Xi Jinping had used to communicate with 100 million or so Communist Party cadres, and his ambitions were very clear. Keep in mind that for example, in Ukraine, you've got China providing dual-use technology and other assistance. You've got Tehran providing drones and perhaps missiles, and you've got North Korea providing both munitions, artillery, and North Korean bodies that can be used to pave the battlefield. So they're all working on this together, and I think it's very important for them to see how it comes out in Ukraine in terms of their own ambitions and how vociferously they pursue them.
Yeah, I guess my own point is, I think China is in a win-win situation geopolitically now, in a way that it's not a real alliance insofar as, if you look at the long-term ambitions of Xi, seeing Russia humiliated and weakened is probably for its benefit, or seeing the West weakened and humiliated is for its benefit.
I'll quibble with you on that. I think he wants to see the West humiliated more than Russia. I think I think Xi Jinping believes that, and one reason he is helping Putin in Ukraine is if Putin should be able to conquer Ukraine, conquer it outright, then Putin will have reason to think, okay, now among other things, I have some of the best combatants in Europe. If I put a bayonet in their back and point them towards Moldova, that's low-hanging fruit. Why not do that? And then how about Lithuania, perhaps, or Estonia, or Latvia? And at that point, we either fight for southern Lithuania, say, and I can tell you why I say southern Lithuania, or NATO falls. And if NATO falls, that's very beneficial to Xi Jinping. So in the long term, I think there's no question that China is a challenge and a threat to Russia, but very long term. At a certain point, but it's not in this next 20 or 30 years, I think, Xi Jinping looks north and says, Vladivostok, what is that? And it means, of course, conqueror of the East. Vlada conquer Vostok East. Vlad, I'm going to take that back. I got lots of people. He doesn't. He's got lots of resources. I don't. I take that. But that's, good 20, 30, 40 years off.
All right. So you ran through all of this examples of current and future cross-border aggression. My colleague at AI, Hal
Wonderful.
Brands,
Brilliant,
has been wearing a sandwich board and ringing a bell, telling people, hey, this standard of not being allowed to expand territory by just simply taking it through force, that was one of those pretty hard-won good principles that we've benefited from over the last 80 years. Be ashamed to lose that. And I do not get the impression that Donald Trump cares very much about that principle.
I feel you're.
Do you disagree?
Feel you're right about that. Because first of all, that's not just. It's a basic principle of international law that aggressive nations can't change borders by force. But it's only an international law if somebody enforces it. There's nobody to enforce it but the U.S. There is no such thing. I'm sure you agree, as an international community that is going to come and do it. The
Right.
UN's not going to do it. It's not going to happen. So yes, I'm not sure I'm not entirely sure he sees that. I'm a little more hopeful about what could happen under Trump in Ukraine. I think we'll know for sure whether my hope is justified on Tuesday, the 18th, because Trump is supposed to speak with Putin. And when he does, we'll see if he exerts as much pressure on Putin as he has on Zelensky to get a ceasefire. That is going to be hugely consequential. If he doesn't, well, that's really bad. Let me just full disclosure on this. I would love to see Putin defeated and humiliated, and I would love to see Zelensky triumph. I think that may have been possible in 2022. I don't think it's possible now. I do think at this point what's feasible is a ceasefire that leaves Ukraine as a political entity and a unique culture. And that is a better outcome than the status quo or most of the alternatives that I see as possible.
So I am going to put on my Karnak turban. We are recording this on Monday, March 17th. You referenced this thing that's tomorrow with the conversation with Putin. I'm going to say Trump is not going to be willing to put the kind of pressure on Putin that he put on Zelensky and Ukraine, in part because he is already, I find it utterly bizarre the way this administration preemptively conceded vast numbers of things to the Russians in exchange for nothing. It feels very Obama-esque. Or like, I'm sure you're probably one of the few people who remember this. Remember shortly after 9/11, I think it was Michael Crowley did this great profile of Biden for the New Republic, and Biden was the head of the Foreign Relations Committee, and Biden's response to 9/11 was, I've been preparing my whole life for this moment, and one of his first suggestions to the entire assembled staff was, you know what we should probably do? We should probably just give, I think the number was $200 million to the Iranians, just to show them that we're not mad at them and we don't think they're part of this. And the concessions that we have seen, going in, again, I think you're probably right about Ukraine not getting back that territory, or at least not all of it, in some sort of ceasefire settlement. But to announce it beforehand, I don't see any purpose to it. To be talking about getting out of NATO, to rule out Ukraine's membership in NATO, to rule out using U.S. forces in a peacekeeping role. Again, I'm not saying I want U.S. forces as a peacekeeping role, but the threat of that is something that you negotiate away, right? Getting rid of the Foreign Influence Task Force, dropping criminal prosecutions of FARA. You can go down a really long list. The halting of the military aid, the whole blow up in the White House. I think, I don't want to sound like Nicole Wallace or something, but I just think it's a fact that Trump has a bit of a man crush on Putin, or whatever you want to call it, thinks that Putin is somebody that he respects and deserves to be treated with respect. And he doesn't feel that way about Zelensky. And he has this it's a lot like terrorists. He has this idea that you need to talk to these foreign country, these bad actors. Without the whole idea of preconditions is bad. The idea of isolation is bad. I hear reports, maybe you got something better, that he really is obsessed with getting a Nobel Peace Prize, and he thinks the way you do it is by playing footsie with dictators. And so I'm very skeptical he's going to be. You're going to be pleasantly surprised.
I'll give you a more optimistic scenario, but it may be overly optimistic, and that is Trump's approach to problem solving is deal making. That's what he does. The deal, he sees himself in this case as having to be the intermediary between Zelensky and Putin, and he doesn't want to humiliate Putin, and he doesn't want Putin overthrown because he doesn't want the chaos that would come with yet another big problem. So, he has threatened Putin with some serious sanctions and says, I can do devastating things through Russia. And we'll see if he does. FDD has prepared a list of the kinds of sanctions that would really bite, not just sting, so that it's possible to do. It also may be possible, I'm not sure of this, but there's plenty of military analysts who believe that actually Putin wants a pause, that his economy is in terrible shape and he doesn't want it to be in worse shape, which serious sanctions would do. And he actually needs to rearm, and he actually needs to recruit more bodies. And that while he's pretending, I don't need a pause, I don't need a ceasefire, he actually does. Now, if you got a ceasefire, and either because of coercion by Trump or because it's what Putin actually wants, and it has to be without the preconditions that Putin has talked about in previous days, then what has to happen is Ukraine has to be armed to the gills with ATACMS and javelins, paid for by the Europeans, paid for by the $300 billion in frozen Russian funds the Europeans have, if they haven't wanted to confiscate, but absolutely should, as people like Neil Ferguson have said. And I like the idea of British and French peacekeepers going over there. And then, yes, Ukraine loses about 18% of its territory. But again, it remains a sovereign, independent country and culture. It becomes a little bit like the Winter War of 1939. What happened then is, but I remind listeners, the Soviet Union tried to drag Finland into the Soviet Empire, just as Putin is trying to drag Ukraine into the Russian Empire. The Finns fought like banshees. Very difficult. What happened at the end? They lost 11% of their territory, but they retained their independence. And 2 years ago, guess what? They joined NATO. Again, this may be way too optimistic and maybe quite as bad as you say, but I've still kind of got my fingers crossed that what we're going to hear is that there's some real pressure on Putin, and Putin says, okay, a ceasefire, 30 days, let's see what happens. And that becomes a frozen conflict. It's not a path to peace. We're not going to see a path to peace. Predators don't make peace with their prey. Putin is a predator. Ukraine is prey. We saw what he did in Georgia in 2008 and is still doing to Georgia. Belarus is a vassal state at this point. My argument has been, and this has been for years, that Putin sees himself as the czar, and as a czar, what does he have to do? He has to restore the Russian Empire. This is his mission at this stage in life. He has more money than he can spend. He can kill his enemies, his critics, journalists with impunity, has been doing so for years. He has a girlfriend half his age who is a rhythmic gymnast. I don't really know what that means, but it sounds intriguing. What he wants to do is restore the Russian Empire. He sees himself as Peter the Great and a little bit of Ivan the Terrible.
I have lots of friends, good friends, dear friends, people I respect, who convince themselves that Trump 2, that the best case scenario was also the most likely scenario. That Trump 2 was just going to be like the first term, right? And the economy's going to go well. We're not going to have a horrible female Democrat in office. And he'll say some stupid things, but he said stupid things the first time, and it wasn't the end of the world. And I always, as I've said many times on here and written, I always agree with them that was the best case scenario. but I didn't necessarily think it was going to be the most likely scenario. And we don't need to relitigate the election. I voted for Paul Ryan and all that. I'm not trying to make that's not the point I'm trying to get at. But in the first term, I think people really downplayed. They gave Trump a lot of credit for the things that we should have credited. H.R. McMaster, Paul Ryan, Mitch McConnell. You can go down a very long list. A lot of the people that Mike Pence put into those second tier positions that actually run the show on a day-to-day basis. And Mike Pence is a good Reaganite. Like, I mean, people who are passionately, anti-Trump can be mad at how Pence was vice president, but behind the scenes, Vice Pence was a responsible grown-up who did responsible grown-up things. And so did HR, and so did a whole bunch of people, right? Those people just aren't there. And I'm not saying that they're all, they're not all Dan Bongino or, Matt Gaetz or anything like that. But like, whether we want to talk quantity or quality, and I don't mean quality of their souls, I just mean quality of them being serious about foreign policy in the way that you are, the way that the Reaganites are, think things this way, right? Want to maintain NATO, want to maintain the U.S.-led international order. There are just fewer of them, and they're less passionate about it. And who do you look to in this administration? I don't want you getting anyone in any trouble, because this, by answering this question honestly, is not a favor to them. But who do you look to there to play that kind of role, to be a zealous advocate, at least behind the scenes, for the kind of foreign policy that you think we need?
One would be Mike Waltz, for sure, who I think is mature and sophisticated. I've known him a long time. We've known him at FTD. He had an association with us. I think he gives very good advice. I think Marco Rubio is giving very good advice. I think Elsie Stefanik, who we also have a relationship with at FTD, will give very good advice. I think there are people who are sophisticated, who I don't think would disagree with anything I've been saying, and they'd probably right now be more towards the optimistic side, but I think they're giving good advice. Now, giving good advice doesn't mean your principal, the president, takes that good advice. But I do think there were some adults in the room, and those are certainly three of them that I would say. There are probably others. Look, I would also say, I know Pete Hegseth pretty well. Yes, he's young and all that, but I've talked to him for a very long time. Known him for many years. I don't think he would disagree with anything I've just said or that you just said. I think he would push in the right direction. One thing I hope is on Trump's mind, and I hope he is being advised, is that he should not want to establish a pattern where historians of the future or people like Hal Brands would say, yeah, here's what happened in the 21st century. First, Obama abandoned Iraq, and that led to the rise of ISIS and tremendous influence from the Islamic Republic of Iran in Iraq and throughout the region. And then, in the most shameful and shambolic way, Biden abandoned our allies in Afghanistan and capitulated to the Taliban. And then, following that pattern, we had Trump abandoning Ukraine to Putin, who is an ally of Xi Jinping, Ayatollah Khamenei, and Kim Jong-un. That is not the legacy President Trump should want. But if he's not careful on this, it could be the legacy he ends up with.
Yeah, I mean, my only quibble with that is I agree with you about Obama and the creation of ISIS, and I take a backseat to no one in my criticism of Biden's handling Afghanistan. But there is, those future historians will not say that those trends completely stopped under Trump 1. Trump's plan was to get out of Afghanistan 2, and basically handed that issue politically to Biden, who managed to screw it up really remarkably. I mean, you have to give him credit about how badly he handled that. It's like, I'm not even mad. I'm impressed. I just like, you really screwed that up terribly. But Pompeo, who I think was one of those grown-ups, right?
Very much.
I have, I can have my criticisms, but at first order level, like what he believed was right and all that kind of stuff. But he was following his principle, who wanted, to bug out of Afghanistan too. Probably, maybe, I'm sure Pompeo wanted to do it in a better way.
I don't think Pompeo did want to do it, by the way. I think Pompeo.
Yeah, I don't think he wanted to do it either.
I remember talking to Pompeo about this, and it was more like, Look, at the end of the day, I have to do what the president wants to do, but I do advise. I mean, I get to whisper, I get to, and I think,
Yeah.
anyhow, that's just for what it's worth. I don't think Pompeo thought that would look. I'm not saying you shouldn't get out of Afghanistan. A lot of people thought that, but the way to do it would have been very complicated, because what you would have had to do is wean the security forces of Afghanistan off their reliance on the U.S. for things like
Right.
fixing helicopters and intelligence and all kinds of things. That would have taken a few years to actually do it properly.
I was fine basically with America having some
Me
presence in Afghanistan for the foreseeable future. I mean, like Bagram base, this is something that Trump now talks about, but like I was saying this at the time, like if you think that, when the Biden people talked about this pivot to China and that's the real focus, well, having like a state-of-the-art air base and surveillance outpost in the middle of that neighborhood was
the
of some
border
value.
on China. Of course, you want to have Bagram. What an asset that would be, and you would think Trump would be able to see that. No, 100%. And by the way, staying with a small force in Afghanistan, we have 28,000 troops right now in South Korea. If we've had them there since 1953. That's what a frozen conflict looks like. That's good training. Our troops over there learn all sorts of things by being in Asia. Forward deployments, FDD has written a lot about this, you don't want all your forces in North Carolina and Missouri. You want forces out around the world, close to where the conflicts could be. And often, as in Iraq, acting as honest brokers among the various factions. That was one of the benefits of having a military force remain in Iraq, which should be there still. Some are, but very few.
So I'm curious about your view on this. So there's this Wall Street Journal piece about the painting that tells you about Trump's foreign policy, and it is a painting of James Polk because Trump likes him because he added territory to the United States. And I'm increasingly I'm mad at myself because I've been railing about the problems with nationalism for a really long time, and I completely missed this point that my colleague Nick Catoggio made, which is that when nationalist movements actually get into power, and they have the ability to do it, right, which is a key point, they're almost always expansionist. They're almost always seeking new territory in the name of greatness, because it's the sort of logical flow of it. And so, if a Belgian nationalist movement takes power, they're probably not going to expand beyond their borders because they can't. But Mussolini, when the moment's right, goes to Ethiopia, Abyssinia, all that. And you start looking around at the history of this, it's the natural argument of it. Like if North Korea weren't in the place that it is, it's obvious that the ideology of North Korea would be expansionist, right? It is expansionist. It says it wants the whole peninsula, right? So anyway, Nick's point was basically we should have seen this coming. And so when Trump comes in, even before he's sworn in, he's talking about taking back the Panama Canal. He's talking about, he says, we're going to call it the Gulf of America, which I think in his mind is kind of like a press release conquering of something, right? It's a linguistic colonialization of territory. He won't give up on Greenland, which, again, if Greenland were a game, I'm in favor of it. I've been in favor of it forever. If Canada were game to merge with the United States, I'd be in favor of it. But they're not. And he cannot get off of this 51st state thing. And he clearly has in his mind that great presidents have their Louisiana purchases. They have their, annexation of Texas. And someone has told him, if you really want to go down in history as a great president, you need to do stuff like that. And that may be why he looks at Putin trying to expand territory and is not offended by it in the same way that you and I are. I'm just kind of curious what you think of that.
There's a contradiction here that I don't understand. I don't know how you can be nationalist, expansionist, and also be isolationist.
I don't think he's isolationist.
Well, they're isolationist in his, within his orbit,
sure.
Right? And some of them have snuck in at secondary and tertiary positions in the Pentagon and other places, and who really want, a fortress America. So I don't really understand. I mean, Greenland is more important than people understand. The way it occurred to me is to look at a map or a globe from above, from the Arctic, and you see if the Arctic is becoming more important for all kinds of reasons,
Sure.
resources, national security. That's the way the missiles fly, all that. You want a more of a presence in Greenland, and there are ways to do it. I don't think the way to do it is to try to buy it up like the Louisiana Purchase. But I think he's not wrong to think it's more important than people understand. The fight with Canada, I don't quite understand, except that Canada is a free rider and shouldn't be. Much too much. They should have a naval fleet in the Arctic, and it should be very, very much liaisoning with the U.S. and challenging Russia. And China has ambitions in the Arctic as well. So he's doing things in some odd ways that you and I wouldn't. Though, look, even with NATO, I mean, my hope, and again, maybe I'm being Pollyanna, is that he is trying. He thinks this is the only way to force the free riders to actually take some. To actually become important players. And you do see Starmer and you do see Macron saying, okay, maybe we do have to have peacekeepers from our countries in Ukraine. Maybe we do have to increase our military budgets. Maybe we can't depend on the U.S. because nothing else has ever worked. They've always said, look, this is an entitlement America gives us. They protect our security. We don't have to spend for it. We don't have to have serious militaries. By the way, that's also the reason why it is wrong for those to say, oh, Putin was threatened by NATO. Nobody was afraid of NATO ever. Nobody ever thought Belgian troops were going to march into Moscow. That's not credible. And nobody ever thought that Ukraine could actually get into NATO because accession requires unanimity. Every member. You think the Germans with Nord Stream 2 were going to vote for Ukraine and NATO? Nor can you come into NATO if you've got territorial conflicts. And we've had Russian, little green men in the eastern Donbass since 2014, the time when. Now, I do think it's possible to say, and I'm sure Trump does, look, Ukraine's not getting back Crimea. It's too important to Russia. That's where the Black Sea Fleet is. They're just not going to. They can't give that up. But I don't know. Again, what I want for Ukraine is that it retains its independence. I think it is all the axis of aggressors want other lands. Putin immediately Ukraine, North Korea, South Korea, and they're going to be getting something in exchange for their bodies and munitions from Russia that will help them with that. Tehran wants to be the hegemon of the Middle East. That's been set back and needs to be set back further. With the destruction of their nuclear weapons development facilities. And China, it's Taiwan for sure. I've been to Taiwan not that long ago, and it's quite interesting there because it's a prosperous free society and they're very, very afraid. But he wants more. The Philippines, Japan, he wants, and beyond, and it's not just the Pacific. This is another problem. There are those in the orbit of the president and maybe himself, I don't know, who think of this idea of spheres of influence, and that's okay. And spheres, and we can be a multipolar world. And America if America is to be great again, it needs to be the preeminent power in the world, bar none, deterring its enemies with military force and great economic might. That's the only way America becomes great again. And my one hope is that what does President Trump mean when he says make America great again? Does he surely, one hopes that he knows it means military might, being able to deter your enemies, economic power, all of the above. Energy dominance too, which he's working on. Energy dominance, he's now got a plan for with Burgum, as you know, and Chris Wright at Energy, who I'm very bullish on. I think what they're doing there is quite correct.
Yeah, I was just at an event where I listened to Burgum for a while. He was great. He was just great. I mean, and not a few people were like, "Huh, he would have been a great vice president." But and I want to get off the Trump thing, and I know it's not why you're here and all that kind of stuff. I just want to just put down the marker on this because I basically agree with you about what our foreign policy should be, probably entirely, right? I mean, like we could find some really marginal disagreements somewhere or other. But my point is like, and you said it's a rosy scenario, and I agree, it is a rosy scenario. I would just argue it's extremely rosy. So rosy, you got to wear shades to look at it. Insofar as I think this sort of, okay, what he's really trying to do is make NATO stronger argument, which you hear all over the place. You're not alone in this. This is the reigning argument on what we can say is our side of the foreign policy universe, right? I think it's probably true of Pete Hegseth. I think it's definitely true of Walsh. I think it's definitely true of, I don't think it's true of Tulsi Gabbard.
No.
And I don't think it's true of a bunch of these sort of second order people over there. The problem is I don't think it's true of Donald Trump. I don't think you say the things he says. This rosy scenario becomes the equivalent of the 4D chess argument. If you're saying that his real goal when he says, yeah, I don't think NATO would come to our aid, I don't think Japan would come to our aid, maybe we need to revisit that security arrangement. I think Canada needs to be a 51st state. If you the argument, it becomes wish casting to me to say, oh, well, the real goal here is to make our alliances stronger and to make these guys stand up more for themselves so our alliance is more robust. At some point, I mean, I hate talking like Maya Angelou, but at some point when people tell you who they are, you believe them. And I think that Donald Trump very much has a spheres of influence foreign policy in his head. I think that's the way he thinks about the world. I think he thinks about the world as if he's a mob boss and this is his turf. And so he can boss around his underbosses. And if they don't show him enough respect, he can slap them around in the Americas. He thinks that Putin is a boss of one of the other 5 families and shows him respect because showing him respect is a sign of how much respect he deserves. And same thing with Xi. And the isolationist stuff, I think a lot of the isolationist talk is a product of the conversation between the New York Times and sort of neoconservative foreign policy intellectuals who think it's either interventionist or isolationist. And the term, there's a great piece in the New York Times about a month ago about this. There's another term that explains better what they are, which is sovereigntist, which is what a bunch of the people who opposed the Treaty of Versailles were. And their basic argument, the sovereigntists are different than isolationists insofar as they just think we shouldn't be tied down to anybody else's rules. No one's the boss of us. If we want to intervene someplace, we can, Monroe Doctrine style. If we don't, that's fine. We want to be an economic fortress America, but in foreign policy, we just want a free hand to do whatever the hell we want without regard to allies, without regard to international norms. And the Phyllis Schlafly people were always that crowd. They were much more, they embraced sovereigntists more than they did isolationists. And so I think we're having a lot of arguments not in Washington these days, not based on the underlying facts. I don't think Trump gives a rat's ass about making NATO stronger. I think that's a pretextual argument used to defend what he's doing. And I don't think of that. And it's the thing that a lot of people around him hold on to feel okay with a policy that they don't particularly like. And it's the thing they say to people like you and me to say, give it time. This is the real goal. I'm deeply skeptical about all of that.
Listen, I think you're right to be skeptical, and you're skeptical as a columnist and a critic and a podcaster. As a think tank, that is, we're not a MAGA think tank, but we're not in a think tank in opposition. We're trying to.
Sure, no, I could completely have sympathy for your plight. You are trying to influence foreign policy for the better, and that is there's some diplomacy involved in that, and it's just like I have you here, and I figure you're gonna. It's like it's your turn to answer this crap, and I feel guilty about it. But
I'm happy to do it. And part of the argument making is it possible, at least possible, that Trump sees, okay, one of the reasons I like Israel is they are out there on the front line taking the point against common enemies, and they do a damn good job of it. Why shouldn't we back them up? I would like him to say, though he doesn't, and I think Zelensky is angry about this, that Trump doesn't see that the Ukrainians are taking the point, sacrificing, testing American weapons, testing Russian weapons, and they are diminishing one of the adversaries that the United States has, the second most threatening adversary, part of this axis of aggressors, and the U.S. and the other countries should be grateful because you want allies like Ukraine who will fight, not allies like Portugal who will not, and who only want to ride on the wagon and not push the wagon. But that argument hasn't been made, I think, convincingly, unfortunately, to President Putin. If you had to go to war with anybody in Europe, who would you want to go to war with right now? I'd want the Ukrainians on my side. They've been brilliant.
Yeah.
They've done things with drones that nobody thought they could do. And by the way, this is the argument we keep making, and I know it's convinced. I don't think it's convincing to a lot of people in the sort of isolationists or MAGA, the people you're talking about. Less than 3% of our Pentagon spending, less than like 2.8%, has gone to Ukraine. The return on that investment is better than anything else we've spent on because of how it's diminished Russia as a threat to the NATO countries with whom we do have an Article 5 commitment. And if that Article 5 commitment were not to be honored, that would be pretty bad. And why? And by the way, when I think this is interesting. Let's see if you do. If Putin were to succeed in Ukraine and conquer it, what would he think about next? I think one of the things there's a couple of things. Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, they all have significant Russian ethnic and Russian-speaking populations. He might say, I need to liberate. But he also has Kaliningrad. Now, people don't necessarily know what that is. It used to be Königsberg when it was Prussian. The Soviets took it away from Germany. It is a province of Russia that is not contiguous, and it is where the Baltic Fleet is located. I can easily see him, Putin, saying, I need a land bridge to there, like I needed a land bridge to Crimea, which is a big part of what he was trying to do. He could get that one of two ways, through southern Lithuania or northern Poland. There's a road right through southern Lithuania. Let's suppose he goes through Belarus, a vassal state, a satellite, and takes it. Are we going to send American boys to die, remember, boys and girls to die, for a road in southern Lithuania? Because if we don't, NATO falls. And if NATO falls, and Xi Jinping says, none of your other alliances are going to hold up. And the Japanese will know that, and the Filipinos will know that. And suddenly they say, we better cut a best deal we can with Xi Jinping. And now America is a great power no more. I wish I could be more. I think I'm probably reasonably convincing to you with this argument. I don't know that we've been convincing necessarily with President Trump with this argument.
It is an entirely plausible scenario to me. I mean, and the fact, I mean, it basically boils down to like first principles. Do you believe that allies are an asset or not?
And not all of them are, but some of them, but they can be. Let's make them that.
Right. Right. And then there's a second order question. And then you start asking, well, are our allies pulling their weight? And I'm fully on board with the criticism of a lot of our allies that they're not pulling our weight. I just don't believe that this is the way you get them. This is a way to get them to invest more in their defense budgets, perhaps. And I think that we're seeing that. It's not a way to get them to be more cooperative with us as allies, right? We've basically now cemented in governments across the world that America can be one election away from trying to dismantle its international security agreements and alliances. And I don't think that's good for us. And I don't think it's good for world peace. And I don't think it's good for the triumph of freedom in the world. And we'll see how it plays.
Listen, I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm really not. I am saying that there's a possibility that the French, the British, they say, okay, we have to protect ourselves. We can't depend on America. We really amp up. We send peacekeepers to Ukraine. We become a reasonable force. And a few years from now, President Tom Cotton goes over there and says, you know what, guys? We've had a rough time, but let's kiss and make up. You guys, you're good guys. We're good guys. We're stronger together. What do you say? And, or President Nikki Haley does that or something like that. Again, too optimistic. I need to be a little optimistic in this business.
Yeah, no, I think all those guys would do the right thing more or less in foreign policy. Again, I might have disagreements at the margins, but I think they understand this basic point that allies are important. They're power multipliers. There was some guy on Twitter the other day who said, he was a German, and said, let me just get this straight. You want us to rearm and march through Poland and fight the Russians, right? I just want to write this down because
I know. I have this argument with Real Correct on our all the time, because
yeah,
isn't the whole point of NATO, among other things, to keep Germany down? But it's been a long
yeah.
time since World War II, and maybe we're in a different situation. Maybe it. I see the irony. I see the paradox. But by the way, I'm happy if Germany doesn't rearm and doesn't get their tanks working, but writes big checks for others.
Yeah,
Just write
that's
the
fine with
big
me too.
checks.
Yeah. Well, and also it's I kind of wish somebody early on had gotten one of the Trump whisperers had gotten in his ear and said, "No, you're missing the point of this stuff. It's not that they're playing us for suckers. It's that we're keeping our feet on their necks. We're making these countries our biggest." Now, I don't think that's the way to think about it, but that kind of like
Mhm.
dominance thing about like the Germans are always either at your feet or at your throat, so we're keeping them at our feet. They kiss our butts. That's how we like it. That would, I think, be more an appealing pitch about what NATO's about to Trump than the current one, which is that they're all members of his country club, but they're not paying their dues.
And you're certainly right in this. If you want to influence, you need to say what are the goals that make sense, and how do you achieve them? That's why I keep saying that President Trump does not want Ukraine to be his Afghanistan, and he does want to make America great again, and that requires peace through strength. That means that means a military that can deter your enemies, because it's always cheaper, no matter how much it costs, to deter your enemies than fight your enemies, even if you defeat them, and even worse if you don't.
Right. So I want to get to Iran and the Middle East and Israel stuff in a second, but I'm kind of curious, just and this is probably something I should ask you over drinks rather than on this podcast. But
I can pour a drink. I got my bar is only a few feet away.
And you know what I say: if you don't start drinking in the morning, you can't claim later that you've been drinking all day.
And you should know this. FDD has long had as his unofficial motto: "If we don't drink, the terrorists win."
So, when you guys founded FDD back in the early 2000s, I was only as of recently at National Review. I had spent much of the 90s as a policy urchin at the American Enterprise Institute in one way or another. So I've been around this universe for a really long. I used to have lunch all the time with the public interest with the guys
and
from National
Wattenberg,
Interest.
of course. I used to watch.
And I worked for Ben
met
Wattenberg.
Diane
right?
Wattenberg the other day in Miami. She says hello, by the way.
Oh, good. Yeah. Is she living there
I don't know if she's full time. No, I don't think she is full time. She was at Richard Pearl's house.
Oh, okay, that makes sense. That universe, right? That's the universe I'm familiar with. And it used to be that the self-described isolationists, that kind of thing, were few and far between and had very little voice in these debates. That doesn't mean there weren't real disagreements between realists and international and all those kinds of. There's always been vociferous debate in the foreign policy world, but basically the right of center world had very, very few people of the MAGA mindset, for want of a better term. And that's part of the reason why the MAGA people have such contempt for the foreign policy establishment of the last 25 years. And I get their arguments, and some have merit, some are directionally right, some are completely wrong. We don't need to relitigate all that here. But I'm just wondering, like the Quincy Institute is now a thing.
Oh, yeah.
Right? And they are isolationists, right?
And left and right, because it's Soros and Koch together that made Quincy. Plus, they have pro-Islamic Republic people like Trita Parsi in senior positions. It's very strange. And they hate FDD, just so you know.
No, I know that. I know. That's sort of why I mentioned them. They're the they're the Shelbyville to your Springfield, right? They're the cats to your dogs. But they have influence now. Like I hear them, and it drives me like I can hit a light pole when I hear NPR describe someone from the Quincy Institute as a conservative foreign policy think tank, which that's a huge part of the ROI of creating a thing in the first place, is just giving people the thought that that's synonymous with or consistent with conservative foreign policy. And I'm so just kind of wondering, how much more fraud is it just sort of this sort of not quite social and not completely professional level, but like the 10 minutes before the panel starts at some geeky think tank thing where you have the different representatives of these different things, is there still collegiality out there, or are people staring daggers at each other? Is it contentious?
It's both. It's very tribal, as you know. Anyhow, I would say, look, from FDD to AEI to Hudson, we're all friends. There are things we disagree on, but we can drink together and enjoy each other. But Quincy, no, I'm not going to get invited for single malt scotches over at Quincy.
Yeah, but like, and we don't have to get in the weeds, and I don't want to put you in a spot, but like Heritage today is not the Heritage it was even 5 years ago, right? And there's some report, I saw some pushback on it, so I don't want to be unfair. I'm a big critic of Heritage these days, but I still want to be right. That they had prepared, Jewish Insider had this piece that they had prepared a report to recommend cutting off aid to Israel, and then there was pushback on that. So I don't know what the truth of it is, but it wasn't as shocking as it would have been a report like that as it would have been 10 years ago, right? Do the traditional foreign policy types, whether you want to call them neocon or whatever,
conservative internationalists,
conservative internationalists,
right.
the Reaganites, do they play well with the America First Institute and that kind of crowd?
Again, as I say, with Quincy, it's because they're so isolationist and so how to say antagonistic towards us. Look, at Heritage, there are a lot of there are people who I like who have left because they disagree particularly on Ukraine. They've moved over to Hudson or AI. There are people there who I still do like very much. Victoria Coates recently wrote a book on Israel, which was just terrific, I thought. And anyhow, but it sort of depends. I would say the real MAGA institutes, the ones that there's a political piece on this today, actually, I believe. Yeah, really? It's kind of saying which are the think tanks that are totally MAGA, which are kind of taking, what do you want us to say, what do you want us to justify? So right, and we're, I don't, I don't know that they're hostile to me, but there's not a lot of intercourse, among us.
Okay, so Iran.
Oh yeah.
I mean, I'm not sympathetic, but it's been a rough year for Iran.
Yes, it has. Yes, it has.
I would rather it be rougher, but there's their control over the Middle East seems to be unraveling to a certain extent, right? They lost an ally in Syria. They lost Hezbollah has been degraded. Hamas has been degraded, not to the degree that either of us would like, but progress.
Very much so.
Right?
They had a strategy. It was a clever strategy. It was, we call it the Ring of Fire strategy, right? It was an imperialist strategy. They had proxies or clients, satraps in various places. So they have Hezbollah was the most important of them, and that's in Lebanon. It's been severely diminished. Could have been even more diminished if you listen to Yoav Gallant, because all the we all talk about the grim beepers, and they were great, but the pagers would have killed 15,000 of them at one time, and Netanyahu wouldn't let Yoav Gallant do that. And we can talk about why it was public. I understand. Hamas severely degraded. Yes, Syria was a very important sort of colony of Iran, and that's gone right now. It's now a colony of Turkey. That creates other problems we could talk about, but it's a better situation now for Israel for sure. You have the Houthis, which were kind of the last really bad boys standing, and great, plaudits to President Trump right now. He is doing what Biden refused to do to the Houthis.
I agree with that entirely, for the record. Like, people say I never say anything positive about Trump. Agree with him 100% that we should be just beating the stuffing out of the Houthis.
We spent billions of dollars.
No one can screw with our trade, right? No one can screw with our boats. You harass our boats, you get shot at.
Yeah,
That's it.
Two things. One is, again, another fundamental international law, one being you don't militarily change borders. The other is freedom of the seas. That goes back a long way. Again, we either enforce it or it doesn't exist. The Houthis say you don't enforce it, we decide. If they decide, next thing now, Iran decides Strait of Hormuz, China decides South China Sea. Now you don't have freedom of the seas, so it has to be enforced. But what Biden did was to shoot the arrows, not the archers. And now even better is, I think, to say, where are these arrows coming from? They're coming from Iran. Rubble a couple of factories where these arrows, where the missiles are being made, and that sends a message to Iran, to the Islamic Republic. But that said, what Trump is doing yesterday, today, I think still and tomorrow, to the Houthis sends a strong message to the Islamic Republic of Iran that, hey, we will use military force in a way the previous administration did not, because the coup de grace at this point is what? Is to destroy their ability to make nuclear weapons, which they got much closer to during the Biden administration than they did during the previous Trump administration. That can be done by the U.S. in about 24 hours. It can be done by the Israelis in about 2 weeks with the U.S. backing. That is a very important, and I think, and it does appear that Trump understands that this regime, which death to America has been chanted there since 1979. I was there in 1979. I was a young reporter covering the revolution. Death to America is their goal. They shouldn't have nuclear weapons to achieve that goal. And by the way, intercontinental ballistic missiles to deliver them to targets anywhere in the world.
So, my friend, former colleague at AEI, now the vice president for policy at the Middle East Institute, he's got his work cut out for him, Ken Pollack. He's never completely persuaded me, but he has made, he makes the best argument I've ever heard for not taking out the Iranian facilities. And part of it is it's an open question about how easily we can do it, right? Which has made me, you're saying we could do it in 24 hours.
Go ahead. All right.
Okay. Yeah. And then also that Iran could have achieved a nuclear weapon anytime over the last 5 years by just turning up the pace. It is deliberate. It's the metaphor I used before was, is it that the plane hasn't reached the airport it needs to land at, or is it circling the airport? And Ken's position is Iran has been circling the airport on completing its program for a while as a international diplomatic strategy. And there are other people who say no, it's just it hasn't gotten to the point where it can do it, and once it gets there, it will do it. And that's the argument that's more conducive to taking out the program, obviously, right? So you are completely satisfied that the U.S. could, in short order, take out the Iranian nuclear program?
B-2s out of Missouri dropping MOPS, maximum ordnance penetrators.
Okay. And it has to be out of Missouri.
Yeah, that's
I'm kidding. It was just oddly specific. I guess that's where we keep those B-2s. Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Sorry, Maine. Can't be your B-2s. All right. So, so walk me through how you think, not necessarily the military part of it. I just assume let's just stipulate that you're right, that the bunker busters will go in and take it out. What does day 2, day 3 look like if that happens?
I mean, they're a much weakened country. I think there's a real opportunity at that point, a real possibility for people in the country to say, if there's ever going to be a revolution, and it's a hard thing to do in a country like that. We talk about why, but that's the moment at which I think you could have a revolution in a because I believe firmly, and I think there's certainly evidence that no one in the Middle East is more fed up with Islamist rule than the people of Iran. And I think that they've had a huge experiment of what Islamist rule means, and it's worse than the Shah ever was. It's harder to overthrow this regime than the Shah, because the Shah wasn't going to kill 10,000 of his people to stay in power. He just wasn't going to do it.
Yeah, and at least Islamist rule in the Gulf states, people got rich, right? I mean, I'm not saying that.
What do you mean Islamist rule in the Gulf? I mean, Bahrain,
I don't mean necessarily as
Yeah.
totalitarian or as evil. I just mean, the Saudis, it's Islamist in the
In a
sense
different
that
way,
it's
but in a different
a
way. I mean, to my great look, when we started FDD, I never thought I would be going to Saudi Arabia and having people shake my hand and say, "Come on in and sit down and have
sure,
coffee with me, and smoke a hookah." And now I do that. I think because I
yeah,
think what the Crown Prince wants is not he's not expansionist. He wants to be influential, but not expansionist, and he sees himself transforming Saudi Arabia into a great country in the future. Now, this is not an easy thing to do, and his dreams of this great city and people from all over the world coming there as scientists and doctors and tourists, very ambitious. But what he wants to do, I do believe he would. And I think this is one of the reasons for what happened on October 7th, is he was getting very close to saying to the Israelis, let's shake hands and be friends. And Israelis were going there.
sure.
They were visiting all the time. And the kind of country he wants, the high-tech country he wants, would have to have relations with Israel, because that's the Silicon
Right,
Wadi of the Middle East, right? So
right.
anyhow, it's different.
Yeah,
Yeah.
just to be clear, I was,
Mm.
my point is, I was kind of making a Gene Kirkpatrick thing about dictatorships and double
I'm
standards.
with you.
Like the
Yeah.
Gulf states that I think they were certainly, when you started, as you pointed out, much more Islamist than they
Yes.
are now. I think the reforms in Saudi Arabia are good and all of that kind of thing. But the point is that like right-wing dictators who actually care about development and stuff, they tend to move towards democracy in ways that totalitarian regimes don't, because totalitarian regimes feel threatened by anything that threatens their hold on power. And that's why Iran, among other things, hasn't gotten richer under totalitarians the way a lot of these guys have gotten richer under essentially
Right.
autocracies.
Right. And look, the first Trump administration did get out of the JCPOA, which was a very fraudulent agreement, and which which at most would have delayed a little bit nuclear weapons acquisition. Biden enriched the Islamic Republic of Iran to try to appease it, and it achieved absolutely nothing. Quite the contrary, it made the Islamic Republic more aggressive, and they did the various things they did. So look, maximum pressure campaign against the economy to crumble it, which is possible. Knock out the nuclear weapons, and hope that the people give maximum support to the people of Iran who want to who do. I think they're very they're sophisticated, they're educated. They would be good neighbors to the Israelis and to others. I don't think that's impossible. I think that's the way to go. Make sure this revolution comes to an end, because this revolution is about. And by the way, the Israelis, whatever, I need to talk to Ken about this. The Israelis do not believe they can say, okay, well, they've got a nuclear weapons and they are dedicated to death to Israel, and they mean genocide, and they mean it in the near term. That's okay. We can live with that. I think they can't. I think that's the predominant view in Israel, and so what they're looking for. They would love the Trump administration to do this for the common good, and if not, just support them in various ways that they can, and let the Israelis do this. And then people say, well, but they have the knowledge, they can build back. Yeah, but another plane with penetrating bombs can go back and knock them out again.
All right, so we're over time here, but I want to get to a sort of more fundamental kind of question. I asked this of a lot of foreign policy types on here. In the 90s, the argument that was made was that if we welcome China into the international trading system, that, as you get richer, history shows you get more democratic. There was, the whole Kuznets curve thing, that once you get past $6,000 or so of purchasing power parity and you go to democracy and never go back. There are all sorts of those kinds of arguments. And obviously those arguments didn't work out. The hard version of those arguments was wrong. But I always tell people when they ask me, when they say, we were just wrong about China becoming a more liberal, more democratic country if we welcome it in, I say we were wrong so far. I still, I still do not rule out the idea that, much like the Iranian government, right? Totalitarian governments are strong, but they're like marble. They're also brittle. And so they look really strong right up until the moment when they crack. And then if the crack is structural, they collapse really freaking quickly. And we've seen that happen many, many times. I'm not saying that's imminent by any stretch of the imagination, but if it were imminent, I'm not sure we would know, because that, Orwell has this passage where he's talking about Gandhi, and he says, one of the problems with Gandhi, or one of the problems with the worship of Gandhi, is that if there's a Gandhi in Nazi Germany or in the Soviet Union, we don't know about it because they and their whole families were dragged off in the middle of the night and murdered. Right? It's only Western democracies that can show, because they're kind of anti-fragile. They show their weaknesses, but by being open about their weaknesses, they can fix their weaknesses and get stronger. Totalitarian regimes can't show their weaknesses, and so those weaknesses fester below our gaze, below our radar, until they make themselves manifest, and then the regime is caught off guard. And so anyway, my there's so much despairing talk these days about the return of great power diplomacy, about democracy under threat everywhere. And I had a lot of arguments with the technocratic left that was saying China was awesome in the late 90s and early 2000s. And now we get this sort of right-wing version of that all over the place. How do you feel looking 50 years ahead? Do you think we're going to look back and say, there was a bad dip in the chart, but the trend towards freedom and democracy picked up, once again? Or do you think that trend line goes flat or goes down?
So many variables to look 50 years ahead. A couple of points. One is, look, giving China most favored nation status, bringing it into the WTO, giving it as a developing nation, which gives it privileges that it still has, turning a blind eye when they stole huge amounts of intellectual property. I think you can generously say, what a great experiment that had to be done. We had to try it. If we didn't try, what would happen? But after what they did to Hong Kong, which broke a treaty, I think we have to understand that we want there to be a free world. I would like to convince President Trump that he should be the leader of the free world. It should be an expanding free world to the extent that's possible. But if not, we want to defend the existing democratic societies that are under siege. FDD was created with the idea, it's the foundation for defending democracies, not democracy, but the existing democracies which are under siege right now from this axis of aggressors. I don't believe that it's all about grievances. I don't think Genghis Khan conquered half the world because he had grievances. I think it's a natural tendency, which we don't have, so we don't understand, to say, I want to conquer other nations. I want to rule. I want to, that's my goal. That's what makes me great. I want to triumph. I think a lot depends on what kind of leadership we have. Most particularly in this country, but in Europe, and the European leadership has not been great either. So that the existing democracies, free societies are defended. They have to be prosperous. They have to be strong. They have to deter their enemies. And if so, there will be others who want to join. And last thing about Ukraine's great sin is it wants nothing more than to be part of a free world led by America. And I wish more people understood that about Ukraine. I think in the Middle East, I think after you get rid of the Islamic Republic of Iran, and I think there's a more possibility for Iran to be free and democratic than other countries. And every country doesn't have to be a democracy, but if they embrace tolerance, the rule of law, like Bahrain does or like the UAE does, that's probably good enough for government work for now. Saudi Arabia is not going to be a democratic society, but I do think the Crown Prince cares what his people think, and that's and that's a good trajectory. I hope Saudis succeed, and I hope they end up as good friends with Israel in a technocratic Middle East rather than a Middle East that is what it is today, which where the anti-Semitism is huge. The anti-Israelism is beyond description. So I'm not really predicting 50 years from now, but because I really don't know. I think so much depends on the decisions we make, and that's why there are think tanks, is to try to make better decisions, try to advise those with power over policy and legislation to make better decisions than they might otherwise, based on such things as good, solid research. And we have a research paper, a monograph coming out soon. Brad Bowman, who heads our military center, you may want to talk to him at some point. And Mark Montgomery, if you haven't talked to him, retired Rear Admiral, brilliant guy. It's on this axis of aggressors and the extent to which they are cooperating militarily, economically, politically, diplomatically, and we have to recognize this as a threat and realize we have right now, a Cold War. Neil Ferguson says that, H.R. says we have a Cold War, and we are not addressing that Cold War the way we should. We don't have the kind of defense budget we had during the last Cold War, and this Cold War is more challenging because it's China, which is more powerful. And the most powerful communist party in history is in China right now. We don't win the Cold War if China wins. We just had a hiatus after the Russians fell.
All right, a lot of things I could chime in on that, but I got to go. Cliff May, thank you so much for doing this.
My
I hope you
great
come back.
pleasure anytime. It's an honor and a privilege to be with you, Jonah.